Thank you all for joining the Intro to Podcasting webinar with DoSpace. I hope you're all social distancing and safe practices and hand washing and that sort of thing. Basically what I'm going to do here is go through this presentation and give you kind of a overview of how to start podcasting, which hopefully you have ideas for. So a little bit about me. My name is Marjorie Sturgeon, and I'm a former journalist. I used to work at a few stations here in Omaha and in Orlando, and then I think my very first station was in Sioux City. And then I've transitioned into digital marketing, and now I'm a small business owner, and working on I'm an independent filmmaker working on a documentary. So just all kinds of little projects keeping me busy. But I run with my husband a podcasting studio. So what to expect in this webinar? What I'm going to show you is kind of a brief history of podcasting, a kind of a timeline, and then I'll look into the future. By what I mean by that is we'll look at some articles that I've kind of been collecting since the summer, and I've even added a slide for this webinar about coronavirus and how people are still podcasting. And then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the fun stuff, developing your idea, a lot of questions to ask yourself. And then we'll kind of touch on recording and editing and some tips. And then we'll get into the technical nitty-gritty, which is the hosting and RSS feed, and what those are, and how they work together to equal a podcast. And then finally, just a quick note on measuring your success. And so basically my overall goal for teaching this webinar, and what I hope you get out of it is kind of how what I experienced is like when you Google how to start a podcast, like there's so many resources out there, it's overwhelming and what to start with. And so you end up having to really just troubleshoot and go through it all yourself. So what I've done is collected what's worked, what I've found to work, and best practices and that sort of thing, so that to help guide you as you create your own workflows. So this slide is much more fun in the classroom setting at DoSpace, because I just like people to shout out what they're listening to. So if you want, you can type it in the webinar chat, and tell us what podcast you're currently listening to. It's always fun to hear this, and the point of this little exercise is it's fun to hear what different types of podcasts people are listening to. They range in everything from the true crime storytelling to the like Joe Rogan, like interviews. Oh, we've got a submission. The School of Greatness and Oprah's Super Soul Sunday. That sounds awesome. And Bob Hope's Dream Big. Okay, so that's one I'm going to look up later. So this just shows the variety of podcasts out there. My Favorite Murder, I've listened to a few of those. I love that. Office Ladies, yes, I love the revival there of The Office. So yeah, just fun stuff, and different types of podcasts that you can listen to, from storytelling to interviews and magazine style. We'll get more into that. So moving on, this kind of a little timeline. I've kind of pulled out some of the key moments, but the source here is built into the, oops, I clicked to the slide. International Podcast Day is in September, and they're actually an organization, and so they've created a timeline of how podcasting has really come along. And so the main points here is early 2000s, the iPod is invented, and that's really the spark point of how podcasting and really changing the music industry came to be, right? So, and then the next step is in 2005 when iTunes has native support for podcasts. That's a huge discoverability tool for a lot of listeners. And now 4 years later, there's a research firm called Edison, and they do a survey every year called Share of Ear. And in this year's survey in 2009, 43% of Americans have heard just the term podcasting. That doesn't mean they know what it is. They've just heard the term, and that's all they they answered yes on the survey. Now I want to jump to 2018, where you can see that has jumped to 64%. So finally, the majority of Americans have heard of the term podcasting, and listenership has grown along with that. And now in between those years, there's been some milestone moments. Apple in 2013 announced there were 1 billion podcast subscribers. And then another moment in 2014 is when Serial podcast really set download records for their podcast. And now even there's like a HBO documentary on it, which I think HBO is offering for free right now through their app if you want to check it out. And that's also about the time when podcasting became more mainstream and more part of like the pop culture lexicon. Oh, oops, too far. Okay, so here's the big slide with all the news articles, and I just like to give like a little like brief overview of the takeaways. And then these are all clickable. So I share this presentation with the DoSpace team, and they send it out typically. Otherwise, I might be able to, I don't know if I can share documents, but we'll figure that out. Anywho, so this first article here, publishing and podcasting industries are getting even cozier. And so this article I found really interesting because it was talking about how like authors can promote their books, and a lot of self-publishers out there can be discoverable on a whole nother platform with a podcast where they talk about like maybe different segments from their book. And also audiobooks has grown in the last 2 years. So those two trends are connected. This next article, we're entering the era of big podcasting. This came out over the summer, so we're in the era, I would say. But it was just a very interesting article about kind of what's to come with podcasting and the people who've developed it and the networks that are growing, that sort of thing. And then it talked a little bit about like advertising dollars, and that's a few other articles here. This article, what's behind Netflix's podcast ambitions? I like this article because it's a real example among creatives. If you are working on a film or a passion project or whatever, like a podcast is a great complement to whatever that project is, because it's a way to highlight kind of like behind the scenes. So if you like Stranger Things on Netflix, they have a Stranger Things podcast featuring more behind the scenes information. So it's almost like a way for Netflix to do director's commentary to their programming, which you don't get with like Netflix, because it's not on DVD and you get all those extras. So that's something to think about. This article, Spotify announces return of Sound Up, podcast accelerator for women of color. There are I wouldn't say a lot, but there are programs out there to increase the diversity of content creators. And the more voices and diversity of voices we have in really every industry, the better for everyone. Because you are the best person to tell your story. And what I love about podcasting is the barrier to entry is so low. And we'll get into why a few slides down. This article up at the top right, the Obamas signed with Spotify, so they're going to have a podcast. And the takeaway there is like, these are high profile creators. Like you're hearing about Will Ferrell doing a Ron Burgundy podcast, the Obamas starting a podcast. I think Joe Biden has a podcast, Joe Rogan, like celebrities and high profile people are starting podcasts. And I mean, are they really even celebrities if they don't have a podcast, but like for us, I would say that should not intimidate you, because you have a story to tell too, or a project that needs shared. So like, don't let that intimidate you. And in fact, it's a good source of inspiration. This next article, podcasters need listening data. So Nielsen is going to call people's homes to ask for it. Oops. Nielsen is a, a, uh, a ratings service for, it began for TV. So I used to work in news, and we used to pay attention to the ratings for our newscasts. Omaha was like a diary market, so they would mail out diaries and people had to fill them out. And then Nielsen would take that data and tell us, how many people were watching the 10 o'clock news. Same thing is still happening. And now the fact that Nielsen is doing this for podcasters is huge, because that means more data for advertisers to target audiences. And that's important. So when you start your podcast and you do want to seek out sponsors, you need to know kind of like your audience. So some of these podcast hosting sites will tell you where people are listening, how they're listening. If they're logged in, they can tell you the gender and age and that sort of thing. So that's important information that'll help you. And you can emulate on a smaller scale for yourself. So this next article, speaking of advertisers, podcast industry expected to create $1 billion in annual revenue by 2021. The takeaway there, that's a lot of money. So that means more advertisers means more demand for unique and creative content. So on our local level, that's an opportunity maybe for some of our small businesses to be found on a different platform by supporting some independent creators, which could, add value to what they're doing. And then the final article I've got on this page, Google makes podcasts searchable. So if you're in digital marketing, SEO stands for search engine optimization, and it's a way of improving the way your website is built to show up higher in the search rankings. And so again, I think I've said the word discoverability a few times already, and that's what that's all about. So if you have a website, that's your number one tool. Second, you have social media, hopefully, and that's your second tool. Third, podcasting is just another platform for your service or product to be discovered on. So the fact that Google is transcribing is helpful in optimizing your content. Now, here's this new slide, because with coronavirus, we're all social distancing. So like running a podcast studio is difficult because you get maybe 2 people in a small room, 2 or more. And then, so how are people doing it remotely? Well, I mean, we're joining together here by Zoom, so that's one option. So what I've provided for here are links to some helpful articles and resources, how to remotely podcast. So this is breaking down, this is a really good one. This is breaking down all the different ways. And basically what it boils down to is you and the person on the other end can record yourselves individually, and then you just kind of stitch it together in what's called post. So in post-production, where you're editing. So you can use whatever devices you have to record. Then she breaks down the advantages and disadvantages. Secondly, there are services out there. I will touch on those in a later slide, but just to name off a few. Zencaster is one, Squadcast is one. I've tested out Squadcast in a free trial, and it took a little bit of a learning curve to work their platform, but it is known for its quality. The next breakdown she has is recording via Skype, so very similar to using like Zoom, that sort of thing. And then recording interviews with a mixer. This is a little more high tech, so it may not be something you can accomplish today, but she breaks down basically all those great things about it. And then this article here, frequently asked questions, I thought was really interesting. I'm going to scroll down to this section. So events, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I like just before we started really social distancing, the Young Professionals Summit was held at the CenturyLink Center, or sorry, CHI Health Center. And, if they would have had to have gone digital, podcasting could be a way to accomplish that. So something to think about if you're an event planner. Oops, gosh, I keep doing that. More remote recording tips from Transom. They're very similar breakdown into the different ways, and a lot of the same suggestions. So just reinforcing like the different technology you can use, like remote podcasting services and that sort of thing. This article here, comedy podcasters adjust to recording remotely. I think I wanted to include this because it's just kind of an inspiration for maybe like how you can still get together with maybe your circles of friends or creative people or business partners. And then this bottom one is another resource from NPR. And actually it's really funny because I took an NPR course about 2 years ago on podcasting, and it's a lot of the same advice, how to record from home. And there's a really funny picture, like this guy's got a I don't know what that is, like a sheepskin over his head to record with. So what I remember from the course that I took a couple years ago was one of the podcasters like in a hotel closet with like the hotel provided robe surrounding him. So there's so many ways you can MacGyver a quality kind of recording space for yourself. And it may seem ridiculous, but it's totally worth it. Then on this other side, has listening increased or decreased due to coronavirus? And so this article from Podcast Business Journal really provides data from Blueberry, one of the hosting services. And it boils down to who you ask, because they've actually seen an increase among genres or decrease by genres. So like religion podcasts have seen an uptick. Sports podcasts have seen a decrease. So kind of that sort of correlation. And then Stitcher released some data about the lack of a morning commute. So people working from home have kind of lost that opportunity to tune out or tune in during the morning commute. So that's really interesting. And so they've actually broken down even by week, like how trends have changed. And it could be just leveling off as people have organized their daily routine from work to home and that sort of thing. So there's this week and last week, they talked about kind of a leveling off as far as like the listener dip. So that's good news. So now getting into developing your idea, the fun part or the hard part, depending on how you think about it. What it boils down to is you're going to be asking yourself a lot of questions. And the first question is, what's the mission of your show? And you want to write this down and keep it handy for you as you're going about recording your episodes, because it will keep you focused. And I liken this to if you've ever been volunteered for a nonprofit or part of like a fraternity or sorority. I was in a band fraternity, and we had, our mission statement, and then our inspiration phrase, strive for the highest, that sort of thing. So the mission of your show is important, because when you're stuck on maybe a decision-making moment, you go back to your mission, and that'll help you stay focused. And what I normally do is play a little clip from transom.org. They are kind of a radio and storytelling training site. And basically, but I'm just going to summarize for you because I am too lazy to figure out how to play audio from a video. So basically, when a good idea for a podcast is a bad idea, there was a woman who won a pitch contest, and the story idea for her podcast was smaller news events that got pushed, kind of a decrease in coverage because of bigger news event days. So her very first example was on 9/11. The news of the day was the terrorist attack. Well, there was kind of a side story to that didn't get as much coverage, and that was that like marine biologists were able to study the ocean in a way that they really never had before, because if you think about it, on 9/11, everything was grounded. So like planes weren't flying, there was no noise from that. shipping traffic was stopped, so the oceans were quiet. And that was a very interesting moment as far as like research and that sort of thing for the marine biology industry. So she had kind of a whole episode talking about that. And then her next episode was about Columbine. And so what she likened it all down to was, it was really like searching a needle in a haystack is what she says, because, and it turned out to be a much harder project than she anticipated in finding those other news stories. So she kind of set herself up for, she had like the first 3 episodes, but after that, she really didn't have much more. So as far as a podcast series, she didn't really have that actual great of a project, and she doesn't want to do it anymore. So she might have had a really good idea for a podcast, but turns out it was maybe just more of a excellent podcast episode. So that's where this question here correlates. Do you have an episode, or do you have a whole show that you can put that effort into? Types of shows, and we kind of touched on this by sharing all the different shows that we're listening to. So that boils down to, there's so many different variations, but the 4 main types of shows are scripted. So it's kind of like a story that you're hearing, or a radio drama. The example I've provided here is Homecoming, which has actually become a show on Amazon Prime. And then the next style is narrative. So think of a lot of NPR style, where you have kind of a narrator in between sound bites from other sources or characters. So it's kind of a news documentary style. Third, you have magazine style, and that would, the example I provided here is Mark Maron. He basically just interviews people, kind of like a late night talk show. So interview style kind of podcast. Q&A panel is essentially what it sounds like, a few people on a panel, and they're interacting with, Q&A questions. So the example I provided here is the community reunion panel. So you can give that a listen if you want. But it's just kind of a way of kind of dual purposing. If you are an event planner and you've got a Q&A planned as part of your conference, you can record that and turn that into a podcast, and boom, you have more content for your event. So more about developing your idea. Again, what's the mission of your show? And as you're deciding that, you'll ask yourself some more questions. How often are you going to do your show? Bi-weekly, weekly, monthly? So I help a few people do their podcasts. And initially, in particular, this one podcaster, he was going to do it monthly, but a sponsor came along, and now he's decided to do it weekly. So that kind of played a role in that. A nonprofit I help do their podcast, they're doing monthly, and it's on the 25th because it correlates with kind of their mission. So they release a new episode on the 25th of every month. The span, are you going to do, basically, are you going to try and do one a week? That's 52 episodes. Are you going to try and do monthly? That's 12. Are you going to do seasonal? You can kind of go with, maybe correlate with something along your idea, maybe like a sports season, that sort of thing. And then the length of your show boils down to kind of what the purpose is. Again, that'll help you decide. Right below there, I say answer should be content driven. So are you going to do 30 minutes, 1 hour, or more? I personally am starting a little podcast that I hope to be like 5 to 10 minutes. And it's just like, I'm interviewing people real quick and just asking them how they're doing amid the coronavirus and that sort of thing. So it's kind of just hoping to be a little inspirational, quick listen. So on this side, I've got some tips for keys to success. A compelling host or guide, because this person is the one, that will be in people's ears. So like someone who's relatable and easy to listen to. Secondly, a unique format to pull in the listener. And these two go together. Get specific. Don't plan to talk pop culture. Dive deep into a specialized topic. I know of a podcast out there that is strictly on He-Man. So they get to talk like a pop culture, but it's strictly He-Man, and it's so specific that they have a niche audience that they've created a little community with. And then finally, regularity matters. Be reliable for your audience. If you want to think about it like this, like think of like your best friend or your spouse, like part of the reason you love them is because they're there for you. So regularity matters. um, so next, developing your idea. And this is where I kind of pause because this is all fun and enjoyable, but there are some cautions. Copyright and fair use are the two most common. Basically, when it boils down to copyright and fair use, I'm not a legal expert, but my advice is don't. Because essentially, like, especially if you're doing some kind of commentary and maybe you want to include a clip from whatever you're talking about, technically you could say that's fair use. But you need to be prepared to defend that, because if you get a letter from the creator of that content and they say, stop, take it down, but you're like, no, it's fair use, you need to be prepared to defend it. And that means a lawyer, and then that means monetary funds. So keep that in mind as you're developing your content. And then, so what I've linked here to are a couple of my favorite resources. This one in particular, the Broadcast Law blog, talks, there's a couple of articles he writes on copyright and fair use that are very interesting because he really follows the legal issues for broadcasters. And then this legal issues guide is has been around for a little while and gets into a lot of the jargon and that sort of thing. So you can kind of dive into that. The other thing is, more often than not, the people who I talk to about podcasting are like, how can I make money with my podcast? And sometimes I joke or like, just go away. But obviously there is some opportunity, but you just need to know kind of some cautions there. So the number one caution I would say is transparency. If you do what's called a live read in your podcast, where you say, this episode is brought to you today by so-and-so, you're being transparent. If you're talking about a product, you need to say it was paid, this mention was paid for. If you ever watch TV and you see like Omaha Every Day on WWT, they'll talk to like a Windows person, and it says on there, this segment is sponsored by, that's the transparency element, because someone paid to be featured. And the same thing with influencers on social media. The influencers who are doing it properly have the hashtag like ad or sponsorship, because again, they have to be transparent that they're being paid to promote whatever it is they're talking about. Okay, so this slide is really just here for the interesting purposes, because we're independent podcasters. So really, your podcast crew may be just you. And so this is you wearing each one of these hats. And it looks different for every podcaster. So these roles, though, come from that NPR course that I took a couple of years ago. They have a producer. So this is the person who's doing a lot of the legwork in arranging guests, writing intros and outros or transitions, researching topics. So they're doing a lot of the prep work. The next role, the editor. So that's not necessarily the person who's moving the sound bites around. This is actually you. If you're doing a lot of the decision making and guiding if you wrote the mission statement, that's you. You're the editor. You're the boss. So you're guiding the focus of the show. The sound designer, this is the one who is using some people call it a DAW, a DAW. It's a digital audio workspace. I call it a editing software. So you're editing the show and you're putting in the music, the intros and the sound bites and that sort of thing. And then finally, there is the host, the voice of the show. Some people would say that they're the talent. They are the relatable person that is the voice of the show. So now we're getting into some of the technical aspects. And basically, when it comes to microphones, my best advice that comes from early on in my news career that I learned, basically use what you have available. If you see breaking news out on the street while you're getting your lunch or whatever you happen to be about while you're social distancing, use what you have available to get a photo or a video. So that's the philosophy I really bring to podcasting, because again, the barrier to entry is so low. If you're using your phone, use your phone. And then like just get your story or your project out there. And if eventually you want to upgrade and you have the capability to do it. So what I've shown here is kind of, if you're using your phone, there's attachments that you can get that range anywhere from really cheap to like $100. So that's one way of improving the quality you're getting from your phone. Next is in the photo here is the H1, or no, I think that's an H4, but a Zoom H4n. I have a H1n and I used it at a music festival and got decent sound. You can hear the festival going on in the background, but you can still, and I think a lot of listeners are forgiving of that because you're setting the scene of whatever it is you're at so that you can incorporate that. So that's just part of the story, right? This microphone here is called a Blue Yeti. That's called a USB microphone. Those are pretty common. And that's also a fairly inexpensive way to connect a microphone to your computer. And then down in the corner, this is an XLR Rodecaster microphone. And with an XLR microphone, and these are the two main differences. You have XLR, you have Bluetooth. XLR, you also need a mixer, and the mixer is what plugs into your computer. So something to keep in mind. You still get audio and pretty good quality audio either way, but there are audio snobs out there and they will say they hear a difference, and the XLR microphones are better, and Bluetooth microphones have kind of a tinnier sound. So if that bothers you, that's kind of some insight there. But basically when it comes to microphones, knowing what kind of show you're going to be doing will help you determine what kind of recording device to use. If you plan to be out and about interviewing people, get a mobile recorder like this Zoom. Another brand is called Tascam. If you're planning to interview people like in your basement, get one of these less mobile microphones that just plug right into the computer, or an XLR and mixer setup. And then secondly, you can interview people remotely, and that's really important to do right now. And there are services to do that. The Zencaster I kind of touched on. Skype is also an easy alternative. And then another thing to do as kind of a backup, or maybe just in general, is ask your interviewee subject to use their own smartphone to record themselves and send you the file. Backups are always a good thing, so something to keep in mind as you're going about your project. I had another thought, but I just forgot it. It'll come to me. Okay, next slide. So, as your tips for getting the best sound. If you're out in the field or recording in your basement, no matter which situation, wear headphones. Some recording devices will show you what's called meter levels, and they bounce up and down as things get louder or softer. That's great visual cue for how good of audio you're getting. But if you're wearing headphones, you'll be able to hear if maybe the sound you're getting is what's called overmodulated. And basically that's what happens when the meters are completely maxing out and the sound ends up being crunchy, and you cannot fix that in post. And it's just really hard to listen to. Another tip, location, location, location. So if you're out in the field, look for areas where there's lots of texture that can absorb the sound. So curtains and carpeted floors, low ceilings, smaller rooms that'll help keep the sound from echoing around you. And then when you're settling in to interview someone or you're recorded yourself, microphone placement. Keep the microphone about a fist length away, and don't let your subject hold it, because people like to fidget, and so they'll fidget with the cord or fidget with a button and something will go wrong. Don't let anyone hold it. If you're using like what I'm using like my Apple earbuds with the microphone on the wire attached to it, tell them to find a quiet place, either a small bedroom or an office where they won't be interrupted. I'm sure you've seen like those news segments where like the kids walking in the background or the guy was doing a TV interview. So have them put a sign on the door to let other people, like roommates or family, know that they're going to be recording and not to interrupt. But most of all, they should avoid large rooms. Then make sure that they are using headphones with a microphone. Hopefully they're a gamer or they've got devices that came with headphones and a microphone, because that will improve the audio quality like exponentially. I just did one with 4 people. 3 of them had headphones and a microphone. 1 of them had an open room, and you could tell when that individual was speaking because it was just so much more echoey. Keep a drink handy. Staying hydrated is very important, but the most important thing is to avoid taking a drink mid-sentence, which happens, you would be surprised. And then lastly, ask them to avoid moving around too much. They need to kind of sit down at least 5 minutes before they're getting ready to record with you and set their phone down in a position, especially if you're doing like a video conference, where the phone or desktop won't be moving. And they need to be themselves in a comfortable position to avoid too much movement. And the reason I advise just like not moving around as much as possible, especially if you're using video at the same time, is video takes up a lot of bandwidth. Not everyone has super great internet. And so if you're moving, you're actually sending more data across your bandwidth pipe. Because those pixels, each new pixel is more data, and so you're filling up your bandwidth, and then you end up with buffering. Then you have to ask them to repeat, and it's just not as good. So the less they move, the better, or just turn off video too. That's another option. Okay, so now here we get into kind of the nitty-gritty of editing. I could teach like a whole day about editing. And so what I always tell the class is if you have a library card, you can access through the Omaha Public Library a service called lynda.com, and just log into that and look for editing tutorials, because they'll give you like all the great tips. And these tips that I'm providing are just like reinforcement, because they'll tell you these same things. Number 1, name your sound files to help you stay organized. That's the biggest lesson from my documentary project, is name your sound files, date them, put a description in it, and the interviewee's name. That'll help you stay organized, because when you're not organized, it becomes that much more difficult. And then the file type that you'll need is MP3, and that's useful for generating the RSS feed. Now, editing software, there is a free one out there called Audacity, which is very common to use. Also, GarageBand, I see a little less common, but there are independent podcasters out there using it. Hindenburg, I don't see actually as much anymore since I started, when I made this presentation a few months, it's been a few, like May, June, it's been a while, April. Pro Tools is a professional sort of software used in like radio stations. And then Adobe Audition is the most common service that I see used. I personally use Adobe Audition. And if you're a business, it's a business expense. So that's useful. Now, this is the technical aspect that is kind of my favorite part, because not a lot of people realize this. So in order to get your podcast out there and available for people to listen to, you need what's called a hosting service. And there are some free options and there are paid options. And it just varies on what your budget is and the things that you need, like different analytics and storage. So very common is a service called Anchor. They do provide free hosting. There was some controversy with Anchor over the summer because they had a weird privacy policy as to who owned the content that was being uploaded, but since they were called out on it, they've since changed that. So I see a lot more people starting out with Anchor. Next is SoundCloud. They provide like 3 free hours of hosting space. So in theory, you could, as you record new episodes, your oldest one gets pushed out. So you could always stick with the 3 free hours. And then SoundCloud also has a paid tier. So you pretty much get unlimited storage for $140 a year. And then there are other paid resources. Libsyn, Blueberry, and Podbean are 3 of the most popular that I see. Libsyn has been around the longest, and followed by Blueberry and Podbean. And NPR, I think, uses Libsyn, so if that gives you any idea. I personally chose SoundCloud because it's very user-friendly. So I've been able to teach a lot of other people how to get their podcast on there, and really just meets all my needs that I need. Yeah, sorry. Okay, and that leads into, so once you have a hosting service, you get what's called an RSS feed. And a lot of these hosting services have begun automating distribution to what's called podcatchers. And that's what you use to listen to podcasts. So Apple Podcasts app is called a podcatcher, Overcast, Stitcher, iHeart, and then there's like all these other ones, Google Podcasts, Spotify is a podcatcher. So that's the puzzle of how a podcast gets onto the internet. You have a hosting service that generates an RSS feed, and then some hosting services will automatically push that to the podcatchers. Currently, like SoundCloud does not, so you have to use a submission tool for all these podcatchers to take your RSS link and basically copy paste it into their submission tool. And then it takes a few days. Typically, you should plan for at least 72 hours before your podcast is approved to be included in these podcatcher directories. In June, I launched a podcast, and we wanted to be ready for people to listen on June 1st. So we used SoundCloud. So it's easy to use SoundCloud because you can direct people to listen on SoundCloud. So it's immediately available there. And then we had to submit to Apple, and we submitted to Spotify. And with Spotify, there was actually some kind of back-end technical issue. I had to contact Spotify support, and they did some kind of manual input, and it took about 4 days for it to finally show up in their directory. And then Apple, actually just recently, 2 months ago, it took again about 4 days for approval for a new podcast. So originally I said 72 hours, and now I'm thinking I should actually expand that because of recent experience. But either way, when you're planning your launch, you want to back time to allow, just give yourself a week probably to plan for that approval process and maybe any technical issues that could go wrong. And now finally, what's the measure of your success? So a lot of people point to download numbers, and that's obviously important. You want to know how many people are listening and whether it's worth your time. But like for me personally, I think you can also measure in other ways. Are you getting content that you can share on your business site? That's important. Are you getting, you can create engagement on your social media channels. that's an important tool as well for measuring your success. So the other points I make here are you're reaching a new audience. So that's a measure of success. You're building brand awareness. That's a measure of success. All those little marketing lingo things that play into how you're measuring your success. If you are feeling fulfilled and enjoying yourself, that's a measure of success. And that's really important. So just keep that in mind as you're going about creating your podcast. And then I've included here also links to some industry sites that kind of boil into like a lot of the jargon when it comes to analytics. And then this podcast guidelines, that's from NPR as well, and that's kind of how they are measuring their success. So these are tools to help you if you do get hundreds and hundreds of listeners, like help you learn the lingo and be able to speak to maybe a possible advertiser. And then this final slide, I have a link to the library's lynda.com resource, which I highly recommend too, because when you complete a lynda.com course, you can add that certification to your LinkedIn profile, and that just ups your skill set. And then on this side, transom.org is a radio storytelling organization that provides a lot of best practices. This NPR guide for students is really helpful in learning a lot more lingo in podcasting. This video explains the different ways you can add monetizing opportunities like a read-in, or explains what a pre-roll is, a mid-roll, and post-roll, little ad slots. And then this Google Podcast Creators 101 from PRX, it takes about a little less than an hour to watch all 10 videos, and I highly recommend just doing that like next, because it'll reinforce a lot of what I kind of touched on here. So I really like their little series there. Will you be sharing the slides? Yes. Either the DoSpace team will be, or I'm going to figure out how to do it here through Zoom. And note, if using, it will ask you to make an account with LinkedIn Learning to access Lynda for free. Yes, go through the library's website. And so that is this link, omahalibrary.org/online resources. And they have tons of other things. Here's the online learning right here. And then Lynda is somewhere in this list right there. So that's where you'll go to log in through Lynda. I can provide a link to download. I could provide a link to download. I do have Dropbox. Stand by. Or I could just share it right through Google Doc.
I think you get to share it through Google Docs.
Yeah.
Sorry,
yes.
I'm piping in.
Yes.
And I mean, if not,
shareable link.
There we go.
Boom.
I was going to say, if not, we could always get a copy from you, and if people wanted to email hello@dospace.org, but it looks like that should work.
Yeah, I always send the slide to someone at DoSpace as well. So just for transparency.
Yeah. So if anybody for some reason doesn't get it, or it's not working, if you email hello@dospace.org, we can always send you this link as well.
Yay. And if there are any other questions, I've got, I guess, 7 minutes, or we can hop off early. I'll be here.
For those who say it's not working, if you actually copy and paste the whole link, copy it and paste it in a web browser, then it would work. So it's not a like, you can't just click on it and it'll open. You'll have to copy the link and then paste it in your Google search. Well, does anybody else have any questions for? Oh, we have a question under Q&A. What do you feel are the advantages of SoundCloud versus Anchor?
Okay, so just personal experience. So I have a podcaster who launched her show in March. She actually took this DoSpace course a couple of months ago and launched her podcast. It's so exciting. But so she launched in March. It's called Ask a Scientist, and she chose to go with Anchor. and she has mostly been satisfied with it, except that one of her episodes did not distribute to Apple Podcasts. And if you're not in Apple Podcasts, it's kind of like not even being out there. So she was frustrated, and she tried contacting support, and they never got back to her. And so she re-uploaded it, and it took about a day and a half for her to finally see it in the Apple directory. With SoundCloud, once I've submitted my a couple of shows I've added, I've got 3 my own and 2 other podcasters. I have had no issues seeing it in the directories, and I haven't even had to bother support. So just kind of a anecdotal comparison there for you. But SoundCloud is a paid service, so there's that. But I do see a lot of people starting out on Anchor, and it is possible to move your podcast to other hosting sites. A lot of them have a process built in already for doing that, so it's common to do. Do podcatchers charge fees? No, they don't. They're to submit, they have just a free tool to submit your podcast. Some do feature, like for podcasters, like subscription services, but that's a little more complicated, and I haven't really explored that. So no fees that I know of for podcatchers.
Oh, we have a few more questions in the Q&A. Can I upload an audio file from Zoom to Anchor?
That I don't know. Typically, Zoom will give you like a download option, and then you download it and just submit through your Anchor profile. So that's probably the process there. Oh, I see that.
The Q&A.
Yeah, I found it. My friend and I want to co-host our podcast from remote locations. Best program or app for that? So what I recommend is doing the free trials for Zencastr, Squadcast, and Blue Jeans. And what I've found is the ones that do video while you're doing your recording actually improve the end quality of your product. So because you can see each other and engage with each other visually. So that's the one thing I do recommend, is ones that have a video component. I do know Squadcaster, while you're recording, shows video, but they don't save the video, and I think they're working on adding that in the future. I really like Blue Jeans so far, but then they have a 2-week trial, and then it's a paid $10 a month service. So but they are known for their audio quality. I hope that's helpful. When talking about podcasting timeframes, are you weekly, monthly? What is your advice on going into a podcast without knowing if you want to do it for 2 months, 6 months, 10 years? What is a good time frame to start with? Well, it depends on how much time you want to commit, and how that fits into your lifestyle. So, and two, the content of your show, is it timely? If so, like weekly might be better. If it's something more of an evergreen sort of topic, monthly is better. So it really depends on the type of show and your own lifestyle, and what to expect from there. And sometimes, like, you don't know what's going to happen in your life. So also, I didn't mention this earlier, but this is a good point. Prep ahead. So the podcasters I'm working with have about 2 shows in the can already. And by in the can, I mean they've recorded it already, so that if they need to take a week off, they've got something they can still put out, or if they go on vacation, that sort of thing. So they're prepared for any like life things that could come up and disrupt their show regularity. Let's see. 2 separate locations would be a better description than remote. I agree. Good point. I appreciate that. Yes. Any other final questions? I think.
Okay, it doesn't seem like it. Well, Marjorie, thank you so much for doing your intro to podcasting webinar. So hopefully, we're hoping that you guys had a lot of great information.
Yes.
And I believe we're going to be doing this again in May, I would imagine. So if you have anybody else interested, keep a eye out for that.
Yay. And I hope you all had fun and stay safe. All
Okay, have a good one, everybody.
right, bye.